A wise colleague of mine said, in reading this text, as soon as we hear the word divorce, many of you are writing entire sermons in your head. And typically, they're not very good. They're about guilt and shame. Sometimes they're about anger and revenge. Sometimes they're about relief. But typically when we hear the word divorce, it's not about a word that brings about thoughts of grace and love, mercy, and forgiveness. The things that the gospel teaches us about. Now, the other thing about this reading that we heard from the Gospel of Mark, that it was paired with this Genesis reading. And sometimes that's not really helpful either. Because it seems from this Genesis reading that the ultimate form of relationship, of companionship, is marriage. And so for those who are separated, or those who are divorced, or who have never married, or are widowed, there's a sense that somehow we failed. That we failed God's intention for us. That somehow God would prefer that we be married. And so we have this context in the midst of what Jesus is talking about in the Gospel of Mark. The context of our own stories and the context of the issue that Jesus is discussing here with the Pharisees. They come to ask him a question, and we're told they come to test him. So let me tell you 4 things about marriage at the time when Jesus was walking this earth. The first thing about marriage to know is that wives were property. Much as a cow, much as your house, wives were property. The second thing to know, that marriages were contracts. And they were contracts between families. Economics, honor, and status. Those are the things that were thought about when getting married. Nothing about love or companionship even. It was a contract between families. Third thing to know about marriages at the time of Jesus is that only a man could get a divorce. Now, we can think about that. Not only is that seen in our ears not fair, but it also had significant repercussions for women. Because if a man asked for a certificate of divorce, that meant that the woman, the wife, was thrown out like other trash, other property that he no longer had need for. And so women who were divorced were destitute. They had no means of support, no means to be cared for by themselves or others. The fourth thing to know about marriage at the time of Jesus is that the Pharisees, the religious leaders, when they're asking him a question, testing him, they're referring back to the Hebrew Scriptures, to the book of Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy chapter 24, the very first verse, it talks about divorce. And it says that a man can issue a certificate of divorce when he finds something objectionable about his wife. Something objectionable about his wife. Now that's very vague, isn't it? And so rabbis at the time that Jesus was teaching were debating, what is it? What were the grounds of divorce? What could be objectionable? And some of you are kind of smiling to each other. But it's true. They talked about Rabbi Hillel, who was a conservative rabbi who looked at Hebrew Scriptures, and he said, anything that the husband finds objectionable would be grounds for divorce, including if he didn't like the way she cooked. On the other hand, there's another rabbi, Rabbi Shammai, and he said that's not the case. That was not the intent in the Deuteronomic Scripture. That instead, in order to get a divorce, there had to be a matter of immorality. So that's where this question of adultery comes up. So then they ask this question of Jesus, so are you in favor of the Rabbi Hillel or the Rabbi Shammai interpretation of the law in Deuteronomy about divorce. And there's 2 points that Jesus makes from this. The first is that he does seem to take the side of Rabbi Shammai. That he says it's not just anything that the man finds objectionable, but there needs to be some sort of immorality, something deeper than that. He understands that marriage is a covenant, it's a promise. And it isn't meant to be taken lightly, to find any reason for being objecting to the other in a couple as being grounds for divorce. But the second thing that Jesus points out, which is something that was really radical for his day, is he says that not only can men get a divorce, but women can too. This was totally not the way of life in that time, in that era. Jesus takes the side of the vulnerable, the most vulnerable. This story from the Gospel of Mark is in the midst of stories which talk about those who are vulnerable. Widows, women who have been divorced, and next we hear about children. So this story that immediately follows, that Mark tells with intention, is to show how Jesus reaches out to those who are most vulnerable. So let me tell you about children in biblical times. You know, there's a great paper that talks about, the title of the paper is something like, "When did children become human in the scriptures?" Because for most of the scriptures, children, and at that time, children were not treated like human beings. Some of it was, I think, self-preservation, because children did not live very long. Only about 25% of children lived beyond a year of age. In that time, children were considered property, just like wives were. In that time, heirs were the children who were important. Younger sons and certainly daughters were not the important people in society. The other thing to learn about children is that in Roman society, the society in which Jesus lived, there was the father as the head of the household, the pater familias. And it was the pater familias who decided which children should survive. Midwives would deliver babies and they would leave them on the ground. And then the pater familias would be called. If he picked up the baby, it was to be nurtured and raised in the household. If he did not, then it was often abandoned. Typically, it came that the father of the household would abandon children who were sick, who had some sort of disability, or they already had too many girls. So the way that children were thought of at the time that Jesus lived were also that they were the vulnerable. And so once again, Jesus radically changes the understanding of who they are as people, who are as children of God, and he embraces them. Not only that, is we're told that these parents are bringing their children to be touched by Jesus. Jesus touches as he heals, right? So we can presume that at least some of these children were ill. And yet Jesus crossed that boundary and touched them and embraced them and invited them to come to him. Reaching out to the vulnerable, to women who have been divorced, to give them the right also to not say that they can be just thrown at the side of the road, but also lifting up children and embracing them. So whatever story that you told yourself when you heard the word divorce, I think it's time to rewrite that. To rewrite it and include love, grace, mercy, and forgiveness. Jesus embraces all of us. All of us are here because for some reason Jesus has called us to be here. Jesus welcomes us here, and you belong here. Amen.